Today, we're diving into one of the most dramatic and unexpected developments unfolding across the Baltic region, a situation that has caught governments, analysts, shipping companies, and military observers by surprise. St. Petersburg's Baltic link has effectively collapsed, and hundreds of shadow ships, vessels operating under murky ownership and questionable registration, are now stranded as NATO nations shut down port crossings across the region. This sudden disruption has not only created a logistical nightmare for Russia, but also sent shockwaves through international trade, maritime security, and global energy routes. The scale of this crisis is enormous. For years, Russia relied heavily on what many called the Baltic backdoor, a loosely monitored maritime corridor used by both legitimate commercial vessels and shadow fleet tankers meant to evade sanctions. These ships often carried oil, fuel products, military cargo, or goods routed through layers of offshore companies to conceal their origin. Now that the corridor is effectively closed, the vessels that once moved freely are stuck in place with nowhere to go. This situation didn't erupt overnight. Tensions have been rising steadily as NATO nations surrounding the Baltic, Finland, Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark, Poland, and Germany, tightened their surveillance and patrols. But the tipping point came when NATO officially activated its enhanced maritime control measures, effectively shutting down crossings and denying access to ships that failed strict transparency, security, and cargo verification requirements. This hit Russia's shadow fleet hardest because these ships were never designed to operate in a transparent regulatory environment. Many of these vessels now sit idle in congested waters. Satellite images circulating online show clusters of tankers and cargo ships bunched together, unable to move north or south. Some crews reportedly have only limited supplies, and communication with Russian authorities has become increasingly chaotic. The once active maritime highway has turned into a floating parking lot. The impact inside Russia, especially for St. Petersburg's port operations, is severe. St. Petersburg has long been a critical hub for Russian exports, a gateway connecting Russia to Europe and beyond. With the Baltic link cut off, many industries dependent on maritime access now find themselves isolated, scrambling for alternative routes that are longer, more expensive, and far riskier. Even the domestic economy is feeling the strain as the stoppage disrupts fuel distribution, supply chains, and export commitments. The shutdown also affects Russia's energy strategy. After facing heavy sanctions and reduced access to Western markets, Russia relied heavily on shadow fleets to transport oil to global buyers. These ships operated in legal gray zones, enabling Russia to move millions of barrels without proper accountability. Now, with NATO blockading crossings, these vessels are stuck in limbo, unable to complete their missions, leaving some shipments partially filled, others fully loaded with crude, and many unable to reach their buyers. NATO's motives became clearer as officials emphasized their concerns over unsafe ship practices, illicit transport, and the broader security risks posed by unregistered or poorly maintained vessels. The Baltic region has become one of the most militarized and highly monitored areas in Europe, and allowing mysterious ghost ships to roam freely was becoming unacceptable to neighboring states. Some ships involved in near collisions, oil spills, and power. Off-navigation incidents only strengthened NATO's case for enforcing stricter controls. At the same time, Russia has accused NATO of economic aggression. Kremlin spokespeople claim the blockade is an intentional attempt to choke off Russia's export lifelines and sabotage regional trade. Moscow argues that NATO's measures go far beyond security and are part of a broader strategy to limit Russia's influence in the Baltic Sea. But NATO counters by saying transparency and safety standards apply equally and that shadow fleets pose a genuine threat to the region. Meanwhile, several NATO countries have increased their naval presence in the area. Patrol ships, surveillance aircraft, and coastal monitoring systems now track every movement within the maritime corridor. Some vessels attempting to bypass checkpoints were intercepted and escorted back, while others were denied passage entirely due to irregular paperwork or suspicious cargo origins. Shipping companies across the world are also feeling the ripple effects. Insurance firms are raising premiums for Baltic operations, and freight brokers are rerouting vessels to avoid massive delays. Major ports in Europe worry that the sudden influx of diverted ships might cause congestion in their own waters, while ports in Asia and the Middle East are experiencing delays from cargo that originated in Russia but can no longer leave the Baltic. Inside Russia, port operators in St. Petersburg are under immense pressure. Warehouses are filling up, export schedules are collapsing, and some shipping yards have temporarily halted operations because they can't move outgoing cargo. Local authorities are trying to redirect shipments south through alternative ports, but these routes are hundreds of miles longer and require rail or truck transport that Russia's infrastructure simply cannot handle at the scale needed. Economic analysts estimate that Russia could lose billions in the coming months if the shutdown continues. The Shadow Fleet alone has seen dozens of vessels sitting idle, costing operators huge sums every day as fuel consumption, crew wages, and maintenance fees keep piling up. Some ships are old and already in poor condition, and being trapped at sea only increases the risk of mechanical failure or environmental contamination. On the geopolitical front, this blockade marks a major shift in Baltic control. For decades, the region was contested but open. Now, with NATO firmly in charge, Russia's maritime mobility is more restricted than at any time in recent history. The Baltic Sea, once a shared commercial zone, has effectively turned into a NATO-regulated lake, leaving Russia surrounded and heavily limited in its access. For the Shadow Fleet, the crisis is even more dramatic. These vessels were never intended to operate in highly monitored areas. Their entire business model relies on anonymity, flexible routes, and ports that turn a blind eye. But with NATO enforcing strict inspections, these ships can no longer hide. Some are being forced to reveal their true ownership structures, while others are being flagged for safety violations so severe that they risk being seized if they attempt to dock anywhere outside Russia. Some crews have already reported frustration, claiming they're stuck at sea without clear instructions. Russian authorities have told many captains to hold position until negotiators can open limited corridors, but so far, NATO has shown no intention of relaxing its control. This uncertainty is causing tension between operators, insurers, and port authorities who all want answers but receive conflicting information from Moscow. Environmental groups are also raising alarms. A large number of vessels sitting idle increases the risk of oil leaks, mechanical failures, or other accidents that could devastate marine ecosystems. The Baltic Sea is a sensitive region with limited water circulation, meaning any pollution could linger for years. NATO officials argue that enforcing strict ship controls actually reduces long-term environmental risk by preventing unsafe tankers from moving freely. Meanwhile, European importers and industrial manufacturers are adjusting to the new reality. Some companies that once received Russian fuel through shadow fleets are now turning to alternative suppliers, including Norway, the United States, and Middle Eastern nations. This shift could permanently reduce Russia's share of the European energy market, something analysts say Moscow may never fully recover from. Another major consequence is the scramble inside Russia to reinforce land-based trade routes. New rail lines, highway expansions, and pipeline projects are being discussed, but these are multi-year efforts that won't solve the immediate crisis. Even if Russia redirects some exports to the Arctic or Pacific ports, those routes are far more expensive and seasonal, making them unreliable alternatives. Russia has also attempted to negotiate with China and India, hoping to reroute some shipments through friendly waters. But geography remains a major obstacle. The Baltic link was the shortest and most efficient path for many goods. Now that it's gone, Russia faces a logistical bottleneck that could slow trade for years. This blockade has also strengthened NATO unity. In recent years, some members debated how aggressively to respond to Russian maritime tactics. But with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the alliance effectively surrounds the Baltic Sea. Their combined naval forces and coastal monitoring capabilities give NATO unprecedented oversight and control. Russian military analysts warn that losing the Baltic link weakens Russia's Northern Fleet strategy. Naval logistics, ship repairs, and supply lines were partially supported by routes through St. Petersburg. The blockade complicates movement not just for commercial vessels, but for military operations as well, potentially forcing Russia to rethink how it positions assets in the region. The stranded ships themselves are a symbol of Russia's growing isolation. Some vessels attempted to switch flags or re-register under different names, but NATO's advanced tracking systems use satellite data, previous voyage records, engine signatures, and cargo logs to identify them regardless of paperwork changes. In today's digital maritime world, a shadow fleet cannot simply disappear. International markets reacted sharply to the news. Oil prices saw short-term volatility as traders assessed the impact of frozen Russian shipments. Meanwhile, European energy markets experienced brief fluctuations before stabilizing when alternative supply routes were secured. The long-term effect, however, could shift energy power dynamics across the region. Russian citizens are indirectly feeling the consequences as well. With export revenues shrinking, local shortages growing, and shipping costs rising, inflation pressures are creeping upward again. Some industries depend on imported components that normally pass through Baltic trade routes. Now those supplies are delayed or stuck entirely, causing factory slowdowns and reduced production. Local businesses in St. Petersburg face uncertainty. The port has historically been a major employer and economic engine for the city. Without regular shipping flow, many jobs are at risk, and businesses that rely on port traffic, logistics firms, repair yards, suppliers, and fuel companies, are struggling to stay afloat. Diplomatic tensions are rising as Russia threatens countermeasures. There have been discussions in Moscow about restricting access to other maritime areas or increasing military presence near NATO ships, but NATO maintains that its actions are defensive and focused on safety, transparency, and the enforcement of international maritime laws. The wider world is watching closely. China, India, Turkey, and several Gulf nations, all of whom purchase Russian oil through unconventional shipping channels, are concerned about long-term supply stability. If Russia cannot move its cargo through the Baltic, it must rely more heavily on the Black Sea or Arctic routes, each of which comes with its own set of geopolitical challenges. Some experts say this could mark the end of Russia's shadow fleet dominance. Without access to the Baltic, the fleet becomes inefficient and costly. If NATO continues to shut down unsafe vessels, Russia may be forced to modernize its fleet or shift strategies entirely. But modernization requires huge investments, and Russia's economy is already strained. In the coming months, the key question is whether NATO will maintain the blockade indefinitely, or whether negotiations could reopen limited corridors. So far, NATO appears firm. Officials say that unless Russia fully complies with transparency rules and safety standards, the shutdown will remain in place. Given Russia's reliance on secrecy and shadow operations, such compliance seems unlikely. Russia is therefore exploring emergency alternatives, including transshipment through Belarus or increased use of land routes to Arctic ports, but none of these can match the Baltic link in speed or volume. The longer the blockade lasts, the more Russia's export strategy will erode. This standoff also reshapes the future of Baltic security. NATO has proven that it can shut down maritime access almost instantly if geopolitical tensions escalate. Russia now knows that its shipping network is extremely vulnerable. This realization could push Moscow toward more aggressive counteractions or force it to accept a limited, heavily monitored role in Baltic trade. For now, the shadow ships remain stuck, engines quiet, lights dim, drifting in uncertainty as the Baltic situation evolves. Crews wait for orders that may never come, and shipping companies face growing losses with each passing day. The once busy paths of the Baltic Sea now serve as a stark reminder of how quickly geopolitical shifts can reshape global trade. As we continue watching this story unfold, one thing is clear: the collapse of St. Petersburg's Baltic link is not just a regional issue. It is a global event with economic, political, and security ramifications that will echo across continents. And that brings us to the end of today's deep review. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned, stay informed, and I'll catch you in the next one.